Welcome to the Coastal Shark Board. My name is Roy Miller. I'm serving as your chair. I'm from Delaware, a governor's appointee. Today with us up front we have representing the Commission, Kirby Roots-Murdy, and we also have Carol Brewster-Geist from NOAA Fisheries. So looking at your agenda for this afternoon's meeting, the first item is approval of the agenda for the previous meeting. Are there any changes or additions to that, those proceedings from the May 2018 Shark Board meeting? Seeing none, I assume they're approved as provided to you. Are there any changes to today's agenda or additions? Seeing none, we'll assume it's approved. Kirby, I gather there were no names on public comment. We'll provide an additional opportunity for public comment when we look at Draft Item 4. So without further ado, why don't we move into Item 4, consider Draft Addendum 5 for public comment. And for that draft addendum description, I'm going to turn it over to Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have Draft Addendum 5 for board review today. My presentation, I'm going to go over, I have an overview of what the draft addendum proposes. I'm going to walk through the structure of the document, statement of the problem, background, go through the brief management options we have, and then I'll take any questions you might have. So as an overview, the board was presented the results of the short fin shark stock assessment in May 2018, as well as the emergency rule measures that NOAA implemented. The board at that point decided not to implement emergency rule measures and instead initiated an addendum to provide flexibility in implementing measures for all species within the coastal sharks F&P moving forward. So specific to this draft addendum, the statement of the problem reads that the F&P, the Fishery Management Plan for coastal sharks, currently only allows for commercial quotas, commercial possession limits, and season dates to be adjusted annually through specification. All other commercial and recreational measures can only be adjusted through either an addendum, and those items that can be adjusted through an addendum are listed in the Adaptive Management section, 4.5 of the F&P, or through emergency action. We went through what emergency action constitutes at our previous meeting and the criteria for it. As you're aware, that's a rigorous criteria. In the recent stock assessment for shortfin makos, though it found that the resource is overfished and experiencing overfishing, the board found that this didn't quite meet the criteria in state waters because of where shortfin makos generally are caught and their life history regarding open ocean portions of their life. So the board chose instead to initiate an addendum to allow flexibility in making changes short of an emergency action. So just a little bit more background on the F&P. As you probably are aware, it was adopted back in 2008, and it facilitates complementary management in state waters to those measures set by NOAA's Highly Migratory Species Division for federal waters, as well as for federal highly migratory species permit holders. The species that are managed under the coastal sharks F&P, there's 8 different complexes. There's the prohibited list, research, small coastal, non-sandbar, large coastal, pelagic, and smooth dogfish. The board does not actively set quotas, but instead annually follows NOAA fisheries in setting specifications for the commercial fishery by adopting the same quota possession limit and season openings and closures. And this includes in-season changes to the possession limit. As you probably are all aware, we recently sent out a notice about that. So I'm going to go through the management options now. the option 1 status quo would not change anything in our F&P. We would still annually, the board would be able to set commercial quotas, possession limits, and season dates through specification. And to change any other commercial or recreational measures would require an addendum or emergency action. Option 2 in the management options section offers to adjust the following measures through annual specification. The plan development team identified these as likely measures that the board may want to adjust annually based on characteristics of the fishery. And they include recreational size limits, recreational possession limits, recreational seasons, as well as area closures for both recreational and commercial fisheries, gear specifications for both recreational and commercial fisheries, and effort controls for both rec and commercial. These changes to the measures would be made once a year, and those changes could be made through a motion. And it's important to understand that under this option, there would not be a requirement for a public hearing or public comment beyond what is offered at that board meeting. Option 2 offers a more liberal version of it, where measures could be adjusted on an ad hoc basis as needed. So those same recreational and commercial measures that aren't currently allowed to be changed through specifications that I just mentioned for option 2 would apply here as well. But these changes could be made throughout the year. And again, these changes could be made through board motion. This would not require a public hearing or public comment. And it's important to note that when looking at the option 2, I failed to mention, if there was an interest to change those specifications after that initial part of the year, it would require a 2/3 majority vote, as all changes to specifications require. So with that, I'll take any questions on the draft addendum at this point. Thank you.
Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. I don't know if it's here, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's about the requirements, the conditions for obtaining a permit. I've had this conversation before about the requirements for dealers to attend classes in order to renew their shark ID certificate in order to obtain a permit. It's really kind of a pain in the neck. If you're a fisherman, you can get your renewal online or your permit online. If you're a dealer, you have to physically go to a class every 3 years. Is that something that we can talk about just by talking about it, or is it something that has to be started through a process like this?
So Eric, I just want to clarify, you're talking about federal dealers? Or
yeah,
dealers?
So the condition to have a federal shark permit, which includes buying things like smooth dogfish, not just pelagic sharks, requires you to have a certificate saying you went to a shark ID workshop. There are several caveats on who can attend and how you can attend. But in my case personally, I've been through 3 classes, and now my permit, I can't renew my permit because I don't have an updated certificate. My certificate expired in March. The closest workshop to get that permit back, there was one in Venice, Louisiana. I think there was one down in the Carolinas somewhere. But, I mean, I've been through 3 classes, and there are other people like me who have done the same thing. And it just seems a little bit overkill that after 3 workshops, I have to go to Venice, Louisiana to buy sharks that are worth about 40 cents a pound. I mean, the economics don't work out, but legally I like to be able to do it. And I'd like to be able to do it online. It just seems kind of unfair where the dealer has to attend a class in person and a fisherman can do it online. So I'm looking for some relief to that condition of that permit.
Thank you for that question, Eric. So this addendum only focuses on state waters management and state permitted individuals. Carol could probably speak to a little bit more the requirements for federal dealers.
Carol, go ahead.
Thanks. So, yeah, I think you asked the question before. We are looking at ways of improving and streamlining not only the shark dealer workshop that is required to be in person, but also the handling and release workshop that is required by commercial fishermen to be taken every 3 years as well. So we're looking at ways of streamlining it, improving it, but also potentially moving it online for people such as yourself who have taken it in person in the past. So we're looking at that, but that's still a little ways away on how we do that. So if you have suggestions, I would definitely love to speak to you offline about that.
Any other questions? Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've got a question about option 2 versus option 3 with respect to opportunity for public hearing. And I'm sort of new to this, so I apologize if this is a stupid question. But so with option 2, when all measures are adjusted through annual specifications, does that require a public hearing process or not? So essentially neither of these options, 2 or 3, would require public hearings on actions, although under option 3, could the board choose to provide opportunity for public hearings, or?
If the board wanted to, they could. I think one of the challenges is that because these two options, 2 and 3, offer for the board to be able to change these measures through board motions, board action at a meeting like this, timing it up to allow for a public hearing beforehand would be very challenging. If anything, that would maybe create a situation where you table a motion until after you had a public hearing, but I think that introduces some more complexity into what these options are currently kind of configured as.
Tony?
And Justin, just to clarify, this doesn't require you all to use board action. It just gives you the opportunity to do so. You can do an addendum for any measure that the board desires to do so. And states also can hold their own information sessions with their state permit holders. You'll likely know prior to the meeting if something's going to be coming up, so you would be able to do that before coming to the commission.
Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as a follow-up to Justin's question, I kind of assumed that we would use this process perhaps more in a complement to actions taken by the federal government, where we were following up on regulations that had changed through the HMS, rather than stepping out and making modifications, let's say, to recreational size limits on coastal sharks, without there being something else that's happened that's caused us to react. I think if we were going to step outside of actions taken at the federal level, then we certainly could, as was just mentioned by Tony, we could take that up as an addendum rather than through specifications. That's how I was understanding this addendum, and if I'm wrong, please let me know. Thank you.
Mike, that's my understanding as well. I think since Adam is here, he was the original maker of the motion at the last meeting. Was that your intent as well, Adam, when you made that motion?
The main goal was we were talking about something that was very species specific at the time. The goal was to make sure that it was across all species. Now, having had the opportunity, and I appreciate the chairman's latitude as well as staff and having given me the opportunity to take a look at some of this in development prior to getting to it today, I think there was some crossover here in terms of what these options would do, but the main goal was to give us flexibility as a body so we would not have to go through an addendum process every time the states needed to put measures in place that were complementary to the federal waters measures. That was the goal. And whichever of these options the board is most comfortable with, achieving that or some modification or hybrid approach of it, that was my intent with the motion at the last board meeting.
Thank you, Adam. Mike, does that satisfy your concern? Are there any other questions at this point in time? I see a hand. Brian.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I guess my question goes to partially to your response, in that there was a vote to take action, and one of the options is not to take action. So is the first option really an option? In other words, if we've already passed a motion to initiate a process, that option is to basically take no steps. So I'm just a little confused by that.
Thank you, Brian. The first option is the standard status quo option. In other words, the first option would be to make no changes to our present procedure. Mike?
If I'm reading this right, so currently we have the ability for the commercial quota and possession and size annual specification. So that would be consistent with option 2 would bring everything under that umbrella. But option 3 would then make these options different than the commercial because it'd be ad hoc, and then the commercial would still remain once a year. Was that the intent? Like, why wouldn't you put the 3 commercial ones under this one too and make everything ad hoc? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes, it makes sense. That idea was not really discussed by the plan development team. Right now, it would be separate, where you'd still have the specifications where commercial quota, size limit, season adjustments would be set, at the once a year, and then these would be set ad hocly.
And maybe, is there a reason that makes more sense to possibly go 2 different paths for the rec primarily and the commercial?
I think for something like the quota, that might be problematic if you're constantly having the ability to change, or if the board chose to change the quota throughout the year. We do have, as I pointed out, season adjustments to the possession limit. So we send out notices when those possession limits fluctuate throughout the year. And then if the quota is met, then we send out a notice about the season being changed. So I think the question is whether those current specifications need to be adjusted more regularly than they already are capable to be adjusted. Does that make sense?
Any other questions? We'll take comments on the draft addendum now, if anyone has comments. Seeing no hands, would anyone feel inclined to make a motion with regard to the draft addendum? Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move that the board approve option 3.
Justin, this is a document that's for board review to go out for public comment.
Okay, sorry. So we'll make a motion to approve the draft addendum, send it out for...
To approve the draft addendum for public comment.
That's what I meant. Thanks, Kirby.
Is there a second to that motion, Emerson? Mike Armstrong.
I'd like to move to amend this by adding language that would move those the commercial quota, possession limit, and was it length, under option 3 also.
As soon as we get that up there, I'll ask if there's a second.
Okay.
Does that capture it, Mike? Is there a second to that motion? I'm sorry. It's Florence. Or Maureen, I'm sorry. Tom, you have a comment or question?
Wouldn't it be more appropriate to move that to the commercial and leave that as a second option between the commercial option 1 and option 2? Instead of putting it in here?
I'm going to ask for a follow-up. Tom, if you can clarify a little bit more, and then maybe Tony has another point.
Well, you already have an option for the commercial fishery. Maybe there should be a second option, an A and B. You choose the A or the B, the way to do it. I'm just asking because we're sticking this on in a different place than the commercial.
So, Tom, under option 2, the commercial regulations that Mike is amending right now are already embedded in option 2. You can already do that through the option 2 method.
Okay.
And so what Mike was pointing out was saying that why would you have one process for the commercial measures and then have a whole different process for everything else?
Right.
And that it should be consistent for both sides. So if you end up in the end choosing option 3, you would want to be able to take action in the same way for all of the measures. So this is just allowing that to happen.
Okay.
Thank you, Tony. And any other comments? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may ask a question of Kirby, would it be the intent that for option 2, I mean, I think we do shark specs on the commercial side every year at a certain point in time. Would it be the intent that we would make all of the same, the rec measures and the commercial measures would all happen at the same time every year? So that for option 2, that list that was provided, that would fall in with what we do on an annual basis. At that same time, we do commercial. And then, so the way I see it is we have option 1, which is no action. Option 2 is we take care of everything all at once, every year at the same time. Or option 3, which is everything, you take all the measures and you can do them anytime you want throughout the entire year, depending on actions as they are complementary to federal measures.
Yeah, that's correct, Mike. That for option 2, it's important to know that right now our current specification process is that NOAA puts out a proposed rule, in the fall. And then this board normally considers those proposed specifications at our annual meeting, but many times don't finalize those specifications until after a final rule has been released by NOAA Fisheries. And so for most years, what happens is we then send out an email vote to the states to sign off on those specifications that are outlined in the final rule. I will point out that unless the recreational measures are, or the measures that are listed under option 2, in addition to these annual specification items currently in place, unless those are changed, we would just be adding another set of items to, I guess, sign off on the board or have the board sign off on, or we could make it so that the board just, unless they decide to add it in to be adjusted, then those normal specifications stand as they are.
Any other comments? Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sure this is confusion on my part, not anyone else's, but when I look at the draft document before us, I see 6 bullets under option 2 and 6 under option 3, and they look identical to me. So I'm not And the motion seems to be suggesting that option 3 should be configured in the same way as option 2, but I'm not seeing those specific items under option 2. So I'm sure I'm missing something here, but it looks odd to me. So maybe some clarification. Thank you.
So my read of the motion to amend is that it's making all of these options, it's making all of these options under option 3, including those that are set annually through specifications, also able to be adjusted throughout the year, whereas option 2 makes everything line up with the annual specification timeline. So option 3 now, as amended, would take our normal annual specifications and add them in as things that could be adjusted ad hocly throughout the year. Does that make sense?
I think so. So these are all inferred via the reference under option 2 that it's through the specification process and already allowed. So even though they're not listed as specific bullet items, okay, I now understand. Thank you.
Any other comments? Mike?
And just to make sure it's clear, my intent is that there's two options. All the management measures either are ad hoc or they're set in annual. That's my intent, was just so that we don't start dividing the management options to two different ways to deal with it.
That's my understanding as well. Thank you for that clarification. Any other comments or suggestions at this time? I guess we're ready. All right, we don't have to do a roll call. I'll just ask if there's any opposition to the motion. Seeing none, the motion is approved. The motion is approved unanimously. I should ask, were there any abstentions or null votes? No? Okay. All right. So we're, yes. Since this was amended, all right, I'll read the motion. Move to approve Draft Addendum 5 for public comment as presented today and to include the regional commercial quotas, possession limits, and season start dates under option 3. Is there any objection to the finalized motion? Any abstentions? Any nulls? Seeing none, the motion is approved. All right, I guess we can move on to the next agenda item, and that is an update on NOAA Fisheries Highly Migratory Species Draft Amendment 11, and we'll call on Carol Brewster-Geis again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right. So I presented our scoping document in the May meeting. At this point, we now have a proposed rule out and a draft environmental impact statement. So if anybody wants a hard copy, we can get you one in the mail later. I'm sure you don't want to have more in your suitcase. So I'll be talking about what we are proposing. The purpose of Amendment 11 is to address overfishing and rebuild short fin mako sharks. As I think all of you know, we've been managing short-fin mako sharks as part of the pelagic shark complex since 1993. In the past 10 years or so, ICCAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, which I'm just going to say is ICCAT from now on, has done a number of stock assessments. The last stock assessment was done last summer in 2017, found that the stock is overfished, with overfishing occurring. Recent catches across all countries are between 3,600 and 4,700 metric tons per year. And catches need to be reduced, catches from all countries need to be reduced below 1,000 metric tons to end overfishing. That's about a 72 to 79% reduction in catches. Based on this stock assessment, at its November meeting, ICCAT recommended a measure that is aimed to maximize live releases. Now, if you remember, ICCAT recommendations is the parlance for a binding measure. It's something the United States must implement as necessary under the Atlantic Tunas Convention Act. So in maximizing live releases, there are a number of different options countries can take. The two that apply to the U.S., there's one for retention that allows dead short-fin makos to be retained by vessels as long as there is an observer on board, or electronic monitoring, which is also video cameras, to verify that the shark was dead. Live or dead short-fin makos could be kept under certain minimum sizes, and they recommended 2 minimum sizes, one for males, 180 centimeters, which is approximately 71 inches fork length, or females, 210 centimeters, which is approximately 83 inches fork length. So ICCAT is looking at its during its current upcoming November meeting to see if these measures are effective, and then in 2019, they're going to be looking at it as a whole, along with establishing a rebuilding plan. So when I was presenting our scoping document to you, there were 4 topics: commercial, recreational, monitoring, and rebuilding. We're still looking at those 4 topics, and I'm going to go through the alternatives for each topic. The first alternative under every topic is the status quo and the no action alternative. These are the alternatives to implement the measures that are not currently under the emergency rule. So this is going back under the commercial alternatives, just allowing people to keep short-fin mako if they have a shark permit. Alternatives A2, A3, and A5 are all very similar. They would all allow retention of short-fin mako sharks by people with a shark limited access permit, only if the shark is dead at haulback under certain conditions. Under alternative A2, that condition is having a functional electronic monitoring system on board the vessel. This is what is currently in place, or similar to what is currently in place under the emergency rule. The difference here is what we are proposing in this case is that anyone could obtain an electronic monitoring system. So while our pelagic longline vessels are required to have it, somebody with a bottom long line who wanted to land short-fin makos could obtain an electronic monitoring system and land under this alternative. It's pretty unlikely you would catch a short-fin mako with bottom long line, but it's an option for people. And alternative A2 is our preferred measure. Under alternative A3, they could keep a dead short-fin mako shark if they agree to allow the agency to use electronic monitoring. The difference here is under Amendment 7, we implemented electronic monitoring for all pelagic longline vessels for bluefin tuna. A lot of people during the comment period were concerned that we were increasing the scope of electronic monitoring and wanted to opt out. So if they were to opt out, they would not be allowed to keep any short-fin mako. And alternative A5 is the same. You could keep a dead short-fin mako as long as there is an observer on board. Observer coverage varies among the different gear types. For pelagic longline gear, which is mainly what you're going to be landing short-fin mako with, it's about 9 to 18%, depending upon the area. We looked at two other options for commercial. Alternative A4 is allowing the retention of live or dead short fin mako sharks as long as it meets the minimum size of 83 inches fork length, and there is either a functional electronic monitoring system or an observer on board to verify that length. And so there are two things to clarify here. Is 83 inches fork length. That is a straight line measurement. It is not curved. It is from the tip of the snout to the curve of the tail, the fork of the tail. And the reason you would need both electronic monitoring or an observer on board for the commercial minimum size is commercial fishermen are allowed to remove the head from the fish. So without that head, you can't do the measurement. But they need to remove the head in order to make sure the meat quality is high enough quality to be sold. And then there's alternative A6, which is prohibiting the retention of all short fin makos, live or dead. So that's it on the commercial alternatives. Recreational, we have a number of alternatives, just like with commercial, that are similar to each other. Alternatives B2 through B5 all increase the minimum size length from 54 inches fork length to a number of different options. Alternative B2 is a straight read of the ICCAT recommendation, so that's 71 inches for males, 83 inches for females. Alternative B3 is what we have in place now for the emergency rule, and that's 83 inches fork length. Again, that is straight line measurement. It is not a curved measurement. Alternative B4 increases the female minimum size to 108 inches. That is the size where 50% of the females are mature. And alternative B5 increases the minimum size of females to 120 inches fork length. And that is, that would allow for record-breaking females to be landed, but there would be very few of them. Alternative B6 has a number of sub-alternatives. This is something we heard a lot through the public comment period on scoping, where people wanted the opportunity to land them during tournament season. So anything outside of the season listed in that first column, the size limit would be 120 inches for both males and females. So for example, alternative B6A, the season would be May through October. If you were to land a mako in November, it would need to be above 120 inches. If you landed it in July, it could be 71 inches if it was a male or 83 inches if it were a female. And then the seasons change and the size limits change. Alternative B6E establishes a process for setting what that season or size would be based on what's happening in the water, so more real time. And this was specific for commenters who really wanted to get in on the tournament season. Alternative B7 is another suggestion we had during comment period, and that was establishing a slot limit for retention of male and females. We felt that would confuse the issue because now you would have potentially a minimum and maximum size for males and a separate minimum and maximum for females, and it just adds to a lot of the confusion. Alternative B8 would be to establish a landings tag program. So this would be somebody comes and gets our HMS angling permit with the shark endorsement, and we give them, as an example, 2 mako landing tags. They would only be allowed to land a short fin mako if it met the minimum size and they still had one of their 2 landings tag in order to put on the mako. Alternative B9 is another preferred alternative. If you remember, in Amendment 5B for dusky sharks, we require circle hooks anywhere south of Chatham, Massachusetts. That was the northernmost range of dusky sharks. Short fin mako sharks can be found above that. So under alternative B9, we are requiring the use of circle hooks throughout the recreational fisheries, so even above the Chatham, Massachusetts line. Alternative B10 is prohibiting the landing, catch and release only. So that's it for the recreational. Moving on to monitoring alternatives, we looked at 3 of them. We are preferring no action. As a clarification, while we are preferring this, we are going to be using our current regulations to select shark tournaments for reporting. We do not currently do that. We only select billfish and swordfish tournaments. Under Alternative C2, we would be requiring commercial fishermen to use their vessel monitoring systems or VMS to report shortfin makos. We felt like we already have enough from them in terms of the logbooks, the observers, the dealer reports, that we did not need the vessel monitoring system reporting as well. Similarly, under Alternative C3, we would be requiring mandatory reporting of all recreational vessels. We feel like we have pretty good numbers coming in from, mainly from the LPS Large Pelagic Survey for shortfin mako sharks, and we didn't need to extend that to mandatory reporting. Under the rebuilding alternatives, we looked at several of them. Under Alternative D2, we would be moving unilaterally without ICCAT to establish a rebuilding plan. Because the United States only has about 11% of all the catches, we did not feel that was the appropriate move. Instead, we are preferring Alternative D3, which is establishing an international rebuilding plan. Alternative D4, we'd be removing shortfin mako sharks from the pelagic shark group and creating its own quota if ICCAT does that. Similarly, Alternative D5 would be implementing some sort of area management if ICCAT does that. ICCAT is supposed to be looking at both of these options in 2019. D6 is an alternative we were requested to look at during the public comment period for scoping, and that's establishing bycatch caps in all fisheries that interact with shortfin mako sharks. The large majority of shortfin mako sharks are caught in HMS fisheries, either the recreational fishery or our pelagic longline fishery. So we did not feel at this point that we needed to establish bycatch caps for other fisheries. Timeline, the comment period ends October 1st. We have a lot of public hearings and meetings with the councils between now and then. We are hoping to have this effective in spring of 2019. Right now we have emergency measures in place. They expire at the end of August. I expect they will be extended, and when they are extended, they will end in spring, and we want this in place before then. So just quick recap, because I know I went through a lot of alternatives. There is the commercial measure that we are proposing that requires dead at haulback as long as there is electronic monitoring in place. There are 2 recreational measures. One is 83 inches straight line fork length. The other is circle hooks throughout. And then the other preferred measure is for the rebuilding option, and that is an international rebuilding plan. So I'm happy to take comments, questions here, and then this slide provides other information if you want to submit comments elsewhere.
Comments or questions for Carol on Draft Amendment 11? Adam Nowalski.
What is the level of consultation that occurred with ICCAT in the development of these measures to be comfortable that ICCAT will find them acceptable towards achieving the rebuilding plan that they're going to implement next year? Or is there a possibility of us being back here again at this time because ICCAT did not find the proposed measures to be acceptable?
So are you asking what would happen in November if ICCAT looks at what all the countries have done and determines that it's not enough has been done or too much has been done?
Correct.
So at that time, the agency would still not have come out with a final rule, and we would have to regroup and decide what we were going to do, whether it would be implementing different options than we have preferred at this point, or restarting the rulemaking process.
Okay, Adam. Any other questions? Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Carol, I'm curious as to the decision to select under, under the monitoring section under Alternative C, the decision to select C1, which would be no additional monitoring outside of what's already in place for commercial and recreational fishing. And I guess my question comes down to how the LPS survey works, in that I was always under the impression that LPS kind of functions like an MRIP, where there's an estimate that's developed based on interviews that take place after fishing happens. And, you know, in thinking about the objective here, which is to reduce the take of short fin makos by increasing minimum sizes, I think what we're going to see, and what we've already seen, I know in my state we have a catch card program and we're seeing very few makos being landed. I think you're going to get to the point where mako landings are going to almost become some type of a rare event, or a more rare event than what they currently are. And the typical pattern on rare event species is that the estimates that come forth as a result of the survey become more and more variable, less and less accurate and precise. And I would have thought that given that very few short fin makos under the intention of the plan would be landed, that there would be some action to require more data as those fish are being brought in. And I'm just curious as to the kind of what you guys tossed around as far as the trade-off between collecting more information and having, I guess, less accurate and less reliable estimates based on fewer landings.
Thanks. So LPS is very similar to the MREP. You are right that it does ask after the fact. The difference with LPS is we have our HMS permit holders. So the LPS actually targets the permit holders, goes to those ports where our permit holders go. So I don't know how to say it, the base that you're starting with is a little bit more exact. We know who we're going, as opposed to MRIP, where it could be anybody. So there's that. There's also the fact that when it comes to sharks, even though we are trying to maximize live release, minimize mortality, mako shark is the shark species a lot of the pelagic anglers are going for. So yes, some people won't want to go fishing for them anymore, but I think a large majority of people are still want to go out and catch the mako sharks. So we're expecting some reduction in effort. We've seen that already. We've had reports of some tournaments being canceled as a result of the size limit, but I don't think we're expecting it to go, overall effort to go down that dramatically.
Tom Foti.
Dealing with a number of species over years that have fallen into that category, you know, by the time fluke gets down to 3 fish, people stop going fishing for them. And when you basically when you go out and catch makos and you can't bring one in the tournament, that's why the tournaments are starting to basically cease to exist. And once that ceased to exist, a lot of those shark fishermen, because that's one of the reasons they always liked to fish, was the tournaments and everything basically put in there. You're going to see a drop in angles, and I think it's going to be more dramatic than you're thinking.
Any other comments, questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Carol. I guess we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is discuss best practices for safe handling and release of coastal sharks from shore sites. Carol?
Thank you, and thank you for all your comments and thoughts on Amendment 11. So best practices from shore-based shark fishing, and this is not only shark fishing from the beach, but also from piers. We've been, those of you who've been around the table know that since we published Amendment 5B, I've been coming almost every meeting asking for states to consider coordinating with us to come up with best practices for release of sharks, particularly dusky sharks from the shore. We already have them from the boat, but we really would like your help in developing them from shore. And this spring and summer has really seen an increase in at least the use of social media to advertise anglers who are fishing from the beach. Almost every week there is a new reporter reaching out to those of us in my shop about, hey, I see this Facebook post, this Twitter post of some guy who has caught this huge shark, pulled it up on the beach. Sometimes they're placing a tag because they have tags from our Apex Predators program, which is a citizen science program where anglers, oftentimes from boats, place tags in the sharks. This has been going on for decades. So some of these anglers that are pulling the sharks on the beach are part of that program. It comes across that they are employees of NOAA, that they know what they're doing, that they are doing all the right things by pulling the shark up onto dry sand, sitting on them, taking pictures. Not all of them are like that, but a good number of them are definitely showing some improper handling techniques. So we have had a lot of confusion. We've had meetings with different states about this and what the message is we're trying to send. So I come again, hoping to entice you into helping us develop some best practices. I took advantage of the PDT meetings about Addendum 5 to work with the PDT and coming up with some options. So one of the options we thought about was signs on beaches. Some states already have these. For those states that don't have them, we meaning NOAA Fisheries, has the ability to help you if you needed to buy the signs. So we thought that these signs could be good to be posted on beaches, piers, any place where shark fishermen or people who are fishing who might catch sharks could be, and that this sign could refer anglers to a website with some of those best practices. So what I have next is a mock-up of the language that could go onto the sign. This is not what the final sign would look like. We'd make it look much prettier with shark pictures and all of that. The text needs to be very brief, because if you're walking along the beach and you want to go out fishing, like all these anglers do, the last thing they want to do is spend 15, 20 minutes reading a sign about how to go shark fishing. They're just not going to do that. So this is the draft text of what we're thinking of, which is releasing sharks, be fast, and then spelling out what we mean by fast, focusing on a quick release, keeping the shark in the water off the dry sand, using the appropriate tackle, preferably circle hooks, cutting the line as close to the hook as possible, being safe, so having a partner, minimizing the handling of the shark, and then tagging smart. So if you have a stressed shark, putting a tag on it's not going to help us get any information. And then critically letting them know that tagging and releasing sharks does not exempt you from any local, federal, state enforcement actions. If you are pulling up a prohibited species and doing a whole bunch of stuff to it, you may have an enforcement action against you. And then going in, our message that we've been trying to get across, if you don't know, let it go. A lot of these shark species are hard to identify. You should not keep it unless you know what it is. And then having the link to our webpage or some other webpage. We were thinking having a QR code so somebody could just scan it and automatically go to the page. Again, this is just the text. We're trying to be brief. Comments to make it briefer would be great. If somebody wants to add something, my understanding is that means something else needs to go away to keep this as short as possible. On the web page, We've already been working in the PDT to come up with a little bit more detail, but we definitely would want more comments on it and really more detailed information. So never drag a shark onto dry sand or lift its head up for a photo, and explaining why that is, how it hurts the shark. And so other subjects we could cover would be including information on prohibited species, some of the regulations, so state along with federal regulations, what kind of tackle to use, other tips on handling, hook removal, and safety. So this is all the ideas we came up with, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, suggestions.
Mel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carol, a couple of things you said struck a nerve a little bit, because we've had some of the same issues that you were talking about with folks calling up and reporting activities. And I know it's not the same group, but the apex predator folks, I guess, that do the tagging or give the tags out to fishermen, it seems to me, a natural source. If you want to, in your T, if you want to teach or communicate proper tagging and handling practices, they need to take some responsibility in that. It reminds me a little bit of, we've had recreational tagging going on in South Carolina, marine species, going back to the 80s. And at one time, we just gave tags to anybody. But then we evolved the program to a point where if you wanted to participate in that program and get tags, you had to go through a level of training and be certified, if you will, to do that in handling practices, proper tagging practices, all of that stuff. So, we became the natural conduit for information going to fishermen about best practices related to trying to increase survivability of, post-release, and including application of tags. And South Carolina is a state in which you cannot tag a saltwater fish without the DNR's permission. And we've tried to convey that to the folks, apex predator folks, and just to say, look, if you've got folks that are going to be doing this in South Carolina, you need to make sure they need to be aware that they need a permit from the DNR to do that. And that we're fine with supporting a program as it's, like you said, it's been going on for decades. Great, but that's a way to really reach out and touch folks that, in terms of communicating best practices, I think, and it's in your, well, not you necessarily, but it's in the control of the National Marine Fisheries Service.
Thank you for that, and I'm sorry. I apologize if I made you a little upset there. That was not my intent.
Oh, not at all. I see where you're coming from and all, but just that's something that you guys kind of have in control there in terms of communicating, I think.
Right. So we definitely send them, all the anglers that request the tags, we send them a lot of information. My understanding is the people in charge of the program do talk with them and talk through it. I have heard before that South Carolina requires the permits. Other states require other things as well. So it's walking that fine line. We're not trying to stop anglers from going out shark fishing, but we also recognize states have different regulations, and that's why we are trying to find some cooperative way of working with everybody for it and for the placement of tags. The program gets people from everywhere. As I said, most of the tags are placed on the boat. There are some from the shore. And of course, just because somebody mainly comes out of Connecticut doesn't mean they're not going to take their summer vacation down South Carolina and not realize that they need a permit or a tag in order to tag, excuse me. So anything we can do to help clarify those regulations, I will definitely ask the people who run the program about whether or not it's possible to certify people and how we would go about doing that. So thank you for that suggestion.
Other questions? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Carol, for your presentation. I like your FAST campaign, right? So there's the quick and the dead, I guess. You may have mentioned this, and I might have missed it, but if somebody is shore-based fishing for sharks, do they need an HMS permit? That's part one of the question, or part A of one question.
No, our permits are issued to the boat. So if you're on the shore, you do not need an HMS permit.
So then there's no issue of possession, because my follow-on question was going to be when do they actually possess the fish, but I guess it doesn't matter.
Not from a federal standpoint. States might have different thoughts on that.
Yeah, state regulations vary in that regard. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Carol. I'm just looking at that sign you had up before, and we have a director that really likes signs, so we've got a lot of them up, and we have pictures of people disregarding the signs. That just looked to me like a lot of text on that sign that is not going to be read. And I know in Delaware and other states, too, a lot of the shore-based fishing for sharks is done by people who are driving on the beach. So I don't know where you'd put that sign where it would really get the attention of people who are driving.
Did you want to respond to that, Carol? No.
No, thank you.
So, Chris Bat-Savage.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I like the idea of the signs in general. We've put signs out on fishing piers to help people release turtles in the safest way possible, and also to report those interactions, get them to the Sea Turtle Hospital, for instance. So, something to tell people how to release sharks safely is a good idea, but there's certainly some logistical challenges, as John just mentioned. I think an obvious one with shark fishing on the beach is a lot of it happens at night. So just the sign being visible is going to be a challenge in many cases, as opposed to the piers that are lighted, or in many cases people fishing during the day will be able to see the signs conspicuously. So I'm not sure how to overcome that challenge without spending a lot of money on lighted signs, and then it might just become an easier target for people who don't like signs.
Thank you for those comments, Chris. Kristen.
Thank you. Florida is really engaged on this issue, and it's certainly a really important issue to us. We're actually doing public workshops on shore-based shark fishing. We hosted one last night even. We're doing 10 around the state, and really getting public feedback on how they want to see that fishery managed in the future. Some of the options we're looking at are a state shore-based shark fishing permit that could have an educational component like the HMS permit does for vessels. So we're definitely looking at things like that. We also already have, over the past couple of years, we've developed what we call Shark Smart fishing guidelines, really focusing on shore-based shark fishing, but also looking at vessel and pier-based fishing. We worked in conjunction with fishermen, law enforcement, NGOs, certainly our staff, our legal department, really talking to everyone we could to really get the best kind of best practices we could get together. And those are on our website. We've got flyers out about them. We distribute them, far and wide. We would really like to stay engaged on this with you. And certainly, we probably have some really good stuff in there about things like gear and stuff like that. That would be good resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Any other comments? Seeing none, I have one, Carol. It wasn't clear to me whether there would be a charge to the states for these signs, and do you know approximately what that would be?
So we were looking at it more, if the state can't afford to put up the signs, we would help pay for whatever signs. And from our initial look, it doesn't look like each individual sign costs all that much. One of the logistical challenges some of the PDT members pointed out was the fact that local regulations might limit where you can put the signs and how many you can put up. But that's something I think the state would have to figure out, and not necessarily us.
Is it your preference that the state elects to erect the signs, they use the signs provided by NOAA Fisheries rather than do their own, or you have no opinion in that regard?
No, I think all we really want is some sort of consistent language and agreement on how to do it. And yes, Florida is a great example, has some wonderful stuff on their webpage that we grabbed. We also worked a lot with New York and Maryland, and one of the Gulf states has some great information as well. That's what I remember off the top of my head. So there's some great information out there already, but not all states appear to have it or use similar language.
Well, we appreciate the feedback we've received thus far. Does anyone have any further feedback for Carol with regard to signage and/or suggestions? Lewis Gillingham.
Carol, I think that state you were talking about is Texas, because I've visited their website. They've got a good bit of information there.
Yes, thank you for that. I am interested in hearing if this group wants to keep doing this and what the next steps could be if this is what they would like.
Does anyone have a suggestion in this regard concerning next steps? Krista.
So I don't know that I necessarily have a suggestion for next steps, but I would like to echo, some of the concerns I've heard around about signs in particular. Also in Florida, it's primarily a nighttime fishery. Also the amount of coastline we have and the amount of beach accesses that we have, that would certainly be a difficult task for us to really get them in all the locations that they are needed. So just more thinking into the signs and kind of echoing some of those earlier concerns.
Tom Foti.
I'm thinking of the same problem with Florida, because we fish in the bays, we fish on the surf, and a lot of these fishing parties have gone out now shark fishing on them. I think a more appropriate place would be on tackle stores where they go to buy their tackle to put in there. You put posters up on that, or you ask to put it on web pages. There, you basically want to do a video and show them what's the proper way of doing it, and put it on the blogs, the local blogs, and put a link to that. But putting on signs on the end of the street, people just steal. I mean, you find them in you'll find them in people's basements, by their bars or whatever. I mean, or they just use it for target practice, one or the other. So, signs don't work. We used to put them up in Newark Bay when I basically talked to Commissioner DEP to ban the taking of crabs in Newark Bay, and we used to put it up in 9 different languages. And as fast as we put them down, as fast as they would steal them, because they didn't want, this way they didn't see the sign, they could do whatever they wanted.
I think your point is well taken, Tom. Signs in tackle shops are generally well received by the owners because it keeps clients engaged when they come into their establishment. So I think that's a useful suggestion. And you're right, signs have a way of disappearing otherwise, or being vandalized or damaged. A comment, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what we're trying to get at is to get this information out in the best way possible so people handle the sharks properly, get them back in the water in the safest manner for the shark and for them. I'm interested in hearing more about what Florida has, and I may talk to you offline, Krista, as far as some of the efforts that you've done, because that might be the route if we want to advance this further. That might be the route we want to go, is look at what another state like Florida has done. It's obviously has done a lot, instead of reinventing the wheel and coming up with similar but different language as far as safe handling practices, because that does get confusing. I know it does on sea turtles, where depending on what agency and what coast you're on, you get different advice on proper handling and release of sea turtles. I don't think we want to have that same situation with coastal sharks.
Maureen?
in dealing with the anglers who are given tags by NOAA so that they can catch sharks and tag them, especially those that are shore-based, as part of dealing with them and responding to their questions, can you suggest that they contact perhaps their state's Marine Resource Division or department? The first time I found out that people were tagging sharks on the shores because I read it on Facebook, and it was one of the guys who dragged a shark up, he took his picture, and he says he's tagging for NOAA. And we're like, he's handling prohibited species, he's dragging them up on the beach. And New York, we don't know about that. We might ask that the people who are tagging, I'm just suggesting, we might ask that they come up and talk to us or fill out some paperwork so that we could recognize them as someone who could handle prohibited species and they're working with NOAA, as opposed to someone who's just kind of doing it freely on a state shoreline. They have the NOAA tags, but they don't have anything else from the state to say it's okay for them to handle these sharks.
That's a good point, Marie. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was very interesting, Maureen, because we've had similar instances where just recently we had some guy that actually asked me to get a scientific collecting permit. He told me he was a contractor for NOAA Fisheries because he was doing the shark tagging, which made me a little suspicious. I thought it might be this, and I talked to our enforcement agents, and he was like a local lunkhead that had already been busted several times for pulling sharks up on the beach, and yet he was able to get these tags, so maybe you need to screen some of these guys better.
We're debating where to go with this particular item. Of course, Carol's looking for feedback, not only with the specific wording on the sign, but which states want signs, be up to the states as to where they're placed, the most effective place, whether it's shoreline access areas, piers, tackle shops, or whatever. That probably should be left up to the state jurisdictions involved because they know their local fisheries and fisheries infrastructure best. Carol?
Yeah, and we certainly don't want to push signs. I'm hearing a lot of logistical issues with signs, so if people don't want signs, then we don't have to go with that. We've gotten pretty adept at doing postcards. We even have a dusky shark sticker, so we could do a sticker with the BFAST and more information. We also have the one-page, more detailed information that we had pulled together on the PDT that we could send out to everybody to review. What I am hearing from the group is it's a good idea and it would be good to have consistent language, but I'm not hearing a lot on what that consistent language necessarily should be. So would it help to see the more detailed web page?
John?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Carol, do you have like a smartphone app that would have this in addition, I mean, like a shark ID type of guide, and you could put some of this information right in there that, because I think a lot of people also would need help in knowing what type of shark they're even catching. A lot of times it might be real useful to have something like that.
Yeah, we don't have that. We have the Shortfin Mako app, which I think does not work right now, if I remember correctly, because there's been so many updates. It's hard to keep up. But there are sharks in a lot of the apps that people use up and down the coast, and I cannot remember the name of the app that's used the most frequently. But we could provide information in that.
Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you're asking for a suggestion, I may suggest that that maybe through Kirby, that Carol and Kirby work to get information out to the states. We're all so different in how we operate, and we're all going to be of such difference of opinion here. I think it might be best to solicit for that input individually through the states to allow us to go back and talk with staff and figure out what best suggestions we might make given this issue, and then perhaps there'd be a follow-up, based on the feedback that the states provide to NOAA on this issue, a follow-up at a future meeting to see if we can all maybe get on the same page. Thank you.
I think that's a good suggestion, Mike. In the meantime, Carol will, if I hesitate to make an assignment, but if you could make the draft signage available to everyone on the board, they in turn could solicit suggestions from staff and get back to you, and perhaps at a future meeting we can finalize at least or help you finalize the wording on the signs, and then it would be up to the states to distribute these signs in the most effective manner that they see fit. And I think John Clark's suggestion for electronic access to this information via smartphones would be is a really good suggestion as well. Anything further on this topic? Maureen.
Hi, Carol. I think you met with Kim McCowan and Chris Scott in New York concerning the taking of sharks from the shoreline and best handling practices. I just wanted to ask, because I wasn't there, what is the thoughts about the fact that in New York, if you're fishing for sharks from the shore, you're targeting prohibited sharks? Should we just go and prohibit all shark fishing from shore? Is there sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
So, yes, we had a discussion about that. We didn't conclude necessarily that it was needed to prohibit shark fishing from shore. From a NOAA fisheries standpoint, that's certainly not our aim to stop fishing, but we do understand New York's issue where if you are fishing from shore, you are most likely catching only prohibited shark species, which is an issue. And we talked about ways of how would you define shark fishing in such a way that you wouldn't be stopping other non-shark fishing, and the difficulties there, and also how would the Apex Predators Program folk know that somebody was shore-based fishing in New York, and is there a way to do that? And so we didn't come to any great conclusions. Both of us walked away with more things to think about and do than any real answers on that. But I think it's an issue that more than just New York has in terms of the targeting and fishing for prohibited species from shore.
Thank you, Carol and Maureen. Tom, I'll call on you, but we do need to wrap this up pretty quickly. Thanks.
The guys fishing from, or the women fishing for sharks from the beach have reels that are completely oversized for what they're doing. The leaders have, hooks on it with cable or heavy wire on it. It's a whole different ball game from when you're fishing for bluefish or striped bass, because they'll just chop through the wire. So pretty much the gear for the guys that are actually directing for a fishery at night for sharks are using, bigger reels, more different tackle altogether, because they realize they're pulling in big fish, and they're also designed for sharks. So they basically have either wire cable or stronger metal leaders. So.
All right, thank you, Tom. I'm probably going to request that we cut off discussion at this point in order to stay pretty much on time. I do want to suggest under other business that staff send out a notice to the states if they request a public hearing on the Draft Addendum 5. They'll be hearing from staff in that regard to determine whether the state wants a public hearing. Is there any further business before this shark board? Seeing no hands, I'll take it that's an indication that we're ready for adjournment. If so, thank you, and this meeting is adjourned.
I have two announcements.